Welcome to the 9th video in this series. In our last video, we discussed writing interesting basslines and using chord inversions. In this video, we're going to tackle our densest and arguably most difficult topic yet, part writing. We're going to learn what part writing is, how it can be approached, and most importantly, how we can use it to bring our beautiful harmonies to life. Before we get started, I do want to take a quick moment to thank my amazing patrons, without whom I would not be able to spend as much time as I do making these videos. I appreciate each of you and the support you give this channel. A special thank you goes out to my newest patrons, Oro or Ori, Nick Johnson, and WIP Shorts. If you're interested in becoming a patron, the link is in the description of this video. All proceeds go towards helping me to make payments on my tuition. So with that, let's get started. So, first of all, what actually is part writing? Well, it's a generic term for an approach taken to harmony in which you treat each harmonic voice as its own little melody. The most extreme version of this is counterpoint, where all harmony is implied and the individual voices are treated as being almost completely independent of each other. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the type of block chords that are common in many types of pop music, where the importance isn't on the voice of each individual harmonic line, but more so on the combined atmosphere that the voices create together. The kind of part writing that we're going to focus on today is somewhere in the middle. You can basically think of it as the evolved form of the voice leading strategies that we've been using so far in this series. Now, before we try tackling this topic, we first need to make sure that we're all on the same page with some important background theory, namely the concept of dissonance. So, in Western music, most intervals can be sorted into one of two groups, either consonant or dissonant sounds, also known as pleasant and unpleasant sounds. Now, I'm not going to get into the science behind consonance and dissonance in this video. We'll save that for a future topic. But for now, we at least need to be able to identify which intervals are consonant and which ones are dissonant. There is some debate on how to classify each interval, but in this video, we're going to classify them as follows. We have perfect consonances, which include unisons, octaves, perfect fifths, and perfect fourths. Then we have imperfect consonances, which will be our major and minor thirds, and our major and minor sixths. Then moving into the dissonances, we have mild dissonances, which are our minor seventh and major second. Finally, wrapping it up with harsh dissonances, with our tritone, major seven, and minor second. These categories will be important to know, and I recommend committing them to memory if you're able. They'll form an important role in our approach to part writing. So now that we're all on the same page with all of that, let's get to the topic at hand. The first step in part writing is to just simply write out and voice lead our harmony. This gives us what musicians fondly refer to as our goose eggs, nicknamed after their appearance when written out in a score. But what we are interested in is not the harmony as a whole, but the movement found in each individual line. Within each harmonic voice, there are only 3 types of basic movement from one tone to the next. We can either repeat the same note as a common tone, move to the next one by a half step or whole step in stepwise movement, or we can leap from one note to the next by an interval of a third or larger. By identifying where these basic types of movement are within our harmonic voice leading, we can find opportunities for leveling up our part writing by adding something called embellishments, or color tones. For example, let's take a look at how we can embellish the common tone movement. There are basically two different kinds of embellishments, or color tones, that can be used here: neighbor tones and double neighbor tones. A neighbor tone is a simple kind of embellishment that leaves our original note by a step, only to immediately return back to it. We can place these in between two common tones shared between two chords, or we can even just add them within a single chord by simply splitting a single voice into its own pair of common tones. A double neighbor tone follows the exact same concept, but instead of just moving up or down by step, it moves in both directions, one after the other. The cool thing about these embellishments is that they don't have to be diatonic to our key. They're embellishments. They're not heard as part of the harmonic language, but rather as just little artistic add-ons, so we can use chromatic tones instead if we like. Actually, let me amend that statement. We can use chromatic tones if we like, but only if they work. Let me explain. So, even though embellishing tones aren't viewed as part of the harmonic language, they still have an impact on the overall dissonance and consonance of our sound. And we need to keep this in mind when deciding which ones to use. If we try using a neighbor tone to breathe more life into our harmony, but end up selecting a highly dissonant one, it's probably not going to have the kind of effect we were looking for. Luckily for us, there are some things we can consider to help us know ahead of time if our embellishment tones will work or not, so we don't have to rely on simple trial and error. The first thing to look at is what kind of intervals and levels of dissonance our embellishment tone forms with every other voice in our harmony, and melody if applicable. For example, let's just look at a C major chord with a simple neighbor tone of F. If we look carefully, we'll see that C to F is a perfect fourth interval. That's a perfect consonance. G to F is a minor seventh, which, if you remember, is a mild dissonance. So, all in all, there's nothing that we need to worry about too much. There's a little dissonance involved, but it's separated by a perfect consonance, which, all in all, makes the note sound just fine. However, if we try moving that F to an F sharp, we get a slightly different result. Here, the F sharp forms a tritone with the C, and a major seventh with the G. Both of these intervals are considered harsh dissonances and make the F sharp stick out like a sore thumb. It's not too bad in this example because we're not exactly shifting chords here, but the effect becomes much stronger when you add a chord change to the mix. After figuring out what level of dissonance we're working with, we can compare that to the typical level of dissonance we find throughout the piece. You can almost think of it like eating some crunchy food. If you're eating a crunchy snack, like granola or trail mix, and you add a single almond to the mix, you're probably not going to notice any difference to the texture when you try eating it. However, if you're making pudding or soup or something like that, and you bite down on the same almond, you're probably going to spit it out just because it's so different from what you were expecting. Dissonance is very similar. If you're working with fairly dissonant intervals in the first place, then you're not likely going to have any issues with another one being added. However, if you're working with predominantly consonant intervals, then the extra crunchy sound is going to stick out from a mile away. After that, the next thing we want to take a look at is how we approach and leave the embellishing tone. The larger the interval we use, the stronger any dissonance that was made will sound. So if we move into a dissonant interval by step, it won't sound nearly as striking as it would if we approached it by a leap. The same thing goes for how we leave it. If we leave a dissonant tone by step, it won't sound nearly as out of place as it would if we leave by leap. As a general rule, the larger the interval we use, the more it will stick out. Finally, we can always ask ourselves, does this note belong to our key? Now, it doesn't have to, but the general rule is that notes outside of our key will stick out more than notes that belong to the key. And that's pretty much it. These are just 4 simple things that we can consider when adding an embellishment tone to our music. And in all honesty, you can probably just rely on your ear if you'd like. Try adding a color tone here and there and see if it works for you. These guidelines don't really come in handy until you find a note that doesn't work, and you want to find out why so that you can find something that does. So, back to our original topic. When adding an embellishing tone during a chord change between 2 common tones, you can choose between neighbor tones and double neighbor tones. And honestly, you don't even need to wait for a chord change. You could add one in the middle of any pitch being held for a long enough period of time, if you really wanted to. Now, when we're working with 2 notes that move by step, we get a few more options available to us. We can try adding escape tones, for example, which are notes that move in one direction by step before resolving by leap in the opposite direction. I like to think of these as notes that don't want to do what they're told. You need it to resolve to the next pitch, but they try running in the opposite direction before getting pulled right back to where they're supposed to be. So in this example, we have a C that wants to transition to a B. But instead of moving down a half step, an escape tone first tries to move in the opposite direction by step to a D. But then it gets pulled right back to the original B that we were trying to transition to in the first place. But this time moving by a third instead of the original half step that it would have taken if we had gone straight from C to B. We could also use suspensions, which are notes from the previous chord that get held just a little bit longer than the rest, before resolving down by step to the next pitch. Here we have a C major chord transitioning to a D minor chord. However, the E in the top voice gets held into the first beat of the D minor chord, so the E goes from being a chordal tone in C major to being a non-chordal tone in the D minor, but it resolves quickly after by moving down a step to the D. The opposite of this would be a retardation, which is the same basic concept, but they resolve up by step instead of down by step. Anticipations are a similar idea. They're notes from the next chord that just jump the gun a bit and enter before the rest of the chord does. Here we have the same C major chord transitioning to D minor, but this time the D from the second chord comes in a bit early as a non-chordal tone before the rest of the chord catches up. Finally, we have chromatic passing tones, and these are notes added between notes that are a whole step apart to help bridge the movement by even smaller intervals. So once again, our C major triad, changing to a D minor triad, shakes things up by adding an E flat between the E and the D. This way, the movement is done by 2 half steps instead of 1 whole step. Next, let's take a look at what our options are for movements from one note to the next by leap. First up, we have appoggiaturas. These are notes that leap towards the next note, but either overshoot it or fall short, having to resolve by step. If an appoggiatura leaps past the target note and has to resolve in the opposite direction, it's considered a balanced appoggiatura because it moved once in each direction. If it falls short of the target note and has to resolve by step in the same direction, it's called an unbalanced appoggiatura because it had to move twice in the same direction. In this example, we have a balanced appoggiatura. The C from C major leaps past the A of D minor and hits a G, so it has to resolve by step in the opposite direction to A. A third type of appoggiatura is called the anticipatory appoggiatura, which leaps to the next note before the chords change and doesn't really resolve until the rest of the chord moves with it. Finally, diatonic passing tones, which are very similar to the chromatic ones we discussed earlier. They just bridge notes that are a third or fourth apart instead of a step apart. And that's it. We now have a fairly comprehensive list of different types of embellishing tones that you can use in your part writing. The last thing I'll say about this list is that unless an embellishing tone's definition requires it to take place at a certain point in the transition of one chord to the other, like with suspensions and anticipations, all embellishing tones are considered weak if they happen before the chord change, and strong if they happen during a chord change. As a general rule, strong embellishment tones will stick out a little more than weak ones. So, if you want to add embellishing tones to your harmony, a good approach you can take is to first start by voice leading your chords. Then look at the individual lines to see if there are any places where you want to add additional personality to any common tone movements, stepwise movements, or even leaps. Try using your ears at first to see what works and what doesn't work. If you find something that doesn't work, and you want to find something that does, then use these guidelines that we've covered to go over why your first choice didn't work and how you can fix it. Finally, feel free to use multiple embellishment tones at the same time, but they need to form a consonant interval with each other. Otherwise, they'll just stick out like a sore thumb and damage the flow of your harmony. But, if that's the kind of sound you're looking for, then go for it. With this in mind, let's take a look at an example. All right, so here we have our chord progression. All right, we've got a pretty simple one, just C major, F major, G dominant 7, and then A minor 7. So let's give this a quick listen to. Pretty simple, pretty standard. Let's get started part writing. So I'm going to drop the bass line an octave just so I have a bit more room to work with. And let's take a look at this top line. G to A is stepwise movement because G is next to A on the keyboard. A is next to B on the keyboard. That's more stepwise movement. Aha! G to B. This is leap movement. All right? So we have an A in between. Let's give a try to see how this will sound. All right? So doing a passing tone, all right, a diatonic passing tone. We're going from B to A to G, breaking things up a little bit so it's not a leap. Now, before listening to this, let's see if we can tell if it's going to sound good or not. Well, F to A is a major third, so that's consonant. That is an imperfect consonance, but it is a consonance. D to A is a perfect fifth. That's a perfect consonance. Then we have G to A. Now, that is a major second, but I'm going to give you a little secret, all right? So two things that impact dissonance. The more notes that are in between two notes, the weaker their relationship is going to be. So the G to the A, this has a very weak relationship. Even though it's a minor dissonance as a major second, it's not. You're not going to hear that minor dissonance that strongly because there's two notes in between them. Likewise, something called octave displacement. The more octaves there are in between two notes, the weaker their relationship becomes. So this G, if we were to move it back up an octave, that would be a little harsher. If we were to bring it up there, it'd be super harsh because it's those two notes right by each other. But the more octaves we displace them, the weaker the relationship is. So right off the bat, I'm going to say perfect fifth, major third, a super weak minor dissonance. This is going to sound fine. Let's give it a quick listen. Oh yeah, see, perfect. So next thing I want to consider is I like to have personally more movement in the second half of my progression than the first half. Because the more rhythmic activity there is in the second half of a phrase, the more forward momentum it's going to have. Likewise, if we were to have more rhythmic activity up here and less here, it would start to slow down that momentum. So let's see if there's anything we can do in the other voices. So here we have F to E. All right, that's stepwise movement. There's not too much, but over here we have F to F. That is a common tone. So let's try throwing in a neighbor tone, and I'm going to do a strong one that gets played with the chord change. All right, and let's see how that sounds. Very nice. All right, let's see. Let's go back to that top line, see what else we can do, because I don't want to get ahead of myself here. G to A. Let's leave this for now. I don't want too much movement at the beginning. A to B. Let's try bridging that. We have a diatonic passing tone here. Let's try a chromatic passing tone here. Give this a good old listen to. That's working for me. One more thing, since I feel like we've got movement, no movement. There's a little blank space in my ear right now. Let's try adding another neighbor tone on this D. We're going to try something that we talked about early in the video. Let's make it smaller since we don't want too much movement and a little variation. But let's cut this chord, this note, which is just a single note, but it's held for the entire measure. So let's bring that down to a C and turn it into a neighbor tone. Ooh, yeah, I like that. So we have a lot of movement here. Let's leave this chord alone. I don't anticipate. No, let's do something. All right. What haven't we used yet? We've got a diatonic passing tone, chromatic passing tone, neighbor tones. Let's see. Anticipation. Let's do an anticipation. All right, we'll pull that there. And then, yeah, because we already used the C, so this neighbor tone will help prepare us for the anticipation by using that pitch quickly before it actually happens. All right, we're getting there. It's starting to get a little too busy. It's starting to get a little too busy. I think it's fine now, but I don't want to do too much more. So there's a lot of movement in the second half. We've got movement for this chord, this chord, this chord. Let's add some movement for this one, and then we'll call it good. We don't want too much, because then we're going to run the risk of doing things going crazy. Let's do another neighbor tone. All right, let's take this down here since that's a common tone movement. Common tone movements are very simple. Ooh, let's stick with B. Are a very simple movement. All right, they're not too obtrusive, but they're nice little embellishments. So when in doubt, neighbor tones are a safe bet. Let's give this a quick listen to. Nice. Now, let's see what that might sound like placed with some strings. All right, same arrangement. Only things I did is I took the middle line, dropped it an octave, then raised everything an octave. So it originally looked like this, but what I did was just the opposite of that. Raise it an octave, then I took this middle line and dropped it an octave. Nothing fancy, but it is a really nice trick if you're just trying to quickly write a part for strings. Let's give it a quick listen.
And with that, we have finished another video. I hope you found it useful. If you liked it, please like and subscribe to this channel and share it with anyone else you think might enjoy it. I want to take a moment to thank all of my patrons again for their support of this channel. I appreciate each of you more than you know, and I also want to thank each of you who are watching these videos. Your wonderful comments, messages, and emails mean the world to me and help keep me excited to keep making new content. So, until next time, keep studying, keep working hard, and as always, keep writing new music.